Greetings to Engadine High School, Year 11s, who I believe are studying my poetry, and I'm very happy to be able to communicate with you in this way. Let me read the poem in question, Childhood in Richmond. I remember my childhood in the back streets of Richmond and the visions that leave a lasting impression, where I lived in a fish shop with my mother and father, and the chips and the grease and the smell and the batter and the stench from the garbage and the thousands of flies that would gather to feast on the shop's throwaways in the lane at the back where we kids used to play. And from our 10 by 12 playground built over the kitchen, we could see all the tin rooftops of Richmond, and Palaco would flash in bright red off and on, the stars, the moon and the flashing neon, and the chimneys and smokestacks that were nearby was a sight you could see as you looked at the sky, and the trees you could see you could count on one hand, and the birds must have flown off to some other land. I remember the fish that would come by the truckload, and the cats in the lane, how they'd feast on the fish bones, and the scales of the fishes, how they'd fly like confetti, and my dad who'd be covered from his head to his toes, and his arms that would glisten just like the fishes he was cleaning and gutting and cutting the heads off, and the pubs that stank of beer and of piss, and the drunks that would stagger and fall out at 6, up the hill they'd swagger to get some chips, or a cray if they had a win on the races, or some prawns or oysters to take to the missus, or some bread and butter soaked in Worcestershire sauce to sober them up before their main course. And my dad, who left Greece when he was 15, with his hope, his ambition and a bag full of dreams, but spent the rest of his life as a slave to a stove, till his dreams were all greasy and his hope had all gone, and the times he got mad and punched shit out of drunks. We didn't know why, but was sure glad it wasn't us. And my mum, who'd pace up and down to the kitchen, taking orders and trays of roasters and boilers, and flake and cooter and brim and snapper to the window to attract the eyes of the buyers. She carried the burden of my father's bad temper when the shop wasn't doing what it should have, while he was worried about the price of potatoes, and her nerves were internal, but her anger was showing, and her legs would swell up from all of that walking, and I often saw her in some corner crying in the fish shop in Richmond from where I came. Well, I hope that my interpretation of that poem read out was similar to your own experiences when you read it yourselves. Richmond, of course, is an inner suburb of Melbourne, and in the early 1950s, when I was growing up in that suburb, in the living on top of the fish and chip shop, it was all terrace houses and a lot of industry. Palaco, I mentioned in the poem, was a shirt factory in Richmond, and there were a lot of manufacturing industries in Richmond at the time. And Richmond was a working class suburb. It had been the place of first residence for many different kinds of migrants throughout the history of Australia. It was a very strong Irish based suburb at the turn of the century, 1900, around Federation time. It's always been strongly a Labor area, Labor Council, and then later on, after the Second World War, the 1950s, there was an influx of migrants from Greece and Italy and Yugoslavia after the Second World War, and then later on, Richmond became a place where Middle Eastern migrants and refugees and Vietnamese during the 1970s after the Vietnamese War. So Richmond's always been a sort of a place where people, it was always a cheap place to live, and people liked to live there, or were forced to live there when they first arrived in Australia. It's different now. All the houses have become trendy, and you can't buy a house in Richmond now for less than $1 million. So things turn around. But I'm afraid all those poor people who suffered in Richmond didn't really benefit by that. Anyway, so it's in Victoria, in Melbourne, in a suburb, and we had a fish and chip shop there. So you ask questions that I paint a picture of the family identity and growing up that I created in My Child in Richmond is very powerful. What did I hope that readers would gain from the poem, and what ideas was I trying to perform? Well, when I wrote the poem, it was one of the earliest poems I wrote. I was sort of concentrating more on form than content, and I was just trying to get it to sort of have sort of 3 beats per line, go 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. I don't think I succeeded in that, but it started a process once I started writing of remembering images of my childhood. It was the first 10 years of my life living in Richmond, but the images seemed to be quite sharp and brutal images sometimes, and a lot of people see this poem as a sad poem, but personally I didn't have a sad upbringing. I had lots of fun in the cafe with the cooks and the waiters and meeting customers and sitting at tables and drawing and writing things all day. I had quite a good life, and it was a family thing because my grandmother would be sitting there with us as well, and my brother, and mum and dad would be working in the cafe, and probably a couple of uncles as well in the kitchen, and so it was a close knit sort of family environment. And I suppose it came through in the poem, and I really wasn't trying to get across any message at all in this poem when I first wrote it, because I wrote it for myself, as I do most of my poetry. I write them primarily for me. They've got to satisfy me first, and I wasn't thinking at that stage in my writing career about writing for audiences. So I wasn't really thinking, how's this going to affect people when I read it to them. More so, when I took this poem and read it out in public at poetry readings in Melbourne, I got a very positive response from the audience, and that told me that some message was getting across, some emotions were being transferred in this poem. And I think, the migrant shopkeeper is sort of a very Australian identity. So a lot of people relate to this, even though they might not have been Greek or they might not have been brought up in a fish and chip shop. The image of that person, even in country Victoria or country Australia, and in country towns, there's always a sort of migrant family running a restaurant, or the catering at the RSL or something like that, or the fruit shop, or so it's, although it talks about my Greek mum and Greek dad and where they came from and everything, it's a really Australian poem because the Australian cafe, the Australian takeaway, is very much, it represents that sort of genre of cultural activity in Australia, which is a sort of takeaway cafe. Yeah, so glad you're studying my poems, and hope you enjoyed this little YouTube blast from Komninos in Melbourne.